All right, we've got Attila Torok. Hey, Attila.
Hey, hello.
So give us a little background on yourself.
So I'm a London-based effect artist. I had worked mainly at Double Negative and ILM in London, and most of my time I spent at ILM when they opened. And since that, I got into tool development. So I was responsible at ILM for our particle simulation pipeline. I was working on our deformable and tearable deformable setups, and also Pyro and Pyro solvers and so on. And this is how I really got into tool development, really, next to ShotWorks.
Right on. So what's today's presentation going to be about?
So today's presentation is about the work I've been doing for SideFX in the past year, which is basically creating tools to make sexy explosions. So it will involve a bit of attribute manipulation, which I find very important that we develop and give the user a bit more control over, which is very important, not just Pyro, but generally working with Houdini. And then we will talk about then connecting that to Pyro sourcing with the new burst tools, which will ignite the explosions. Then we will make trails out of the explosions, and I will show you how to set up different type of situations. Then I will show two examples of a fireball and an explosion that is like, call it a side explosion that could like burst out from the side of a building. And with that, we will looking at like shading and what are the new features, what is different. And the meantime, I will share some of the things and some of the tips and tricks, what I've been used to create the marketing materials you all have been seeing already.
Fantastic. Well, let's get started.
All right, so let's jump right into the presentation. So the main things we're gonna talk about are attribute modification. So this is something to do with Pyro sourcing. Then the actual Pyro sourcing, where we introduce two workflows. So this is one is the burst workflow, which is like the core of the explosion. This is the one which ignites the explosion, and the trail workflow, which with this you can create trails coming out from the explosion from these bursts. And there is a way to combine bursts and trails and create a more robust, a more complex setup for explosions. So if we have a look at them in practical use, so here you see all of these little bursts coming out, and each of these bursts emit a set of trails with them. So this is the thing which this burst and trail workflow will allow you to do. On a side note, this is not part of the presentation, but if you are interested in making something similar, there are two additional elements in this explosion. So one is the constant sourcing from the bottom of the screen. So there are points scattered on ground which constantly emit fire and smoke into the simulation. So this is something I just did additionally, and the other thing is to make the explosion look more complex is this white smoke. So if you looking at references, you will notice that explosions are not just like the big fireball and whatever suit they create, but you will see white smoke, you will see black smoke on the other side. So there is a lot more interest going on in an explosion, and this is what I tried to create here. So this is basically just the white smoke is just a secondary simulation advected by the main simulation mostly, and shaded as white smoke with the scatter phase set to something like -0.030 -0.04 to give this a more lighter kind of smoke, which differs from the main smoke. Then here actually we can have a look at the bursts and the trails and how they combine together, so you might have a better overview how they relate to each other. Then after all of this sourcing, we will talk about simulation and shading. So shading in like what has changed in 18.5 and how you can make your explosion looking really nice. And simulation wise, we will be looking at two examples. One is this fireball, which is pretty much like the shelf tool fireball, but couple of additional little trick which I want to show you how to do. And the other one is the side explosion. Well, I call it side explosion because like this is something that could like burst out from the side of a building. Here you see a couple of shading techniques. For example, in this one, I left the like you will see some bit of a like fire left over in the smoke, and in this one, for example, you will see these tendrily details, like how the smoke kind of forms the soot from the fire, which is something that you can notice on real explosion references. So attribute modification for 18.5 we have updated the attribute noise node, and we have created a new like family of nodes, the attribute adjust nodes. So we have now adjust float, adjust integer, and adjust vector nodes. So why do we need them? And what we wanted is to give more functionality for each attribute type. So you might need different controls to modify vector attribute than modifying, let's say, an integer attribute. And also we wanted to give more functionalities to control each of these attribute types. So if we have a look at the attribute adjust float node, for example, here you see that you can adjust the value with the constant, a uniform value across with all elements across the geometry. So but also the node provides way to do basic compositing, so basic attribute compositing, so you can combine two attributes together now. But one of the main part of this attribute adjust float node is randomization. So you can specify a range in which you will get random values. You are also able to use step size, which will run the values to integers. And again, you can set ranges in various ways. One of the most important one is specific values, in which you will see here that I can create even not continuous ranges with different step sizes. So for example, it's very handy if you want let's say attribute like start frame, and you have certain ranges in mind you want to distribute. So for example, here what I'm saying is I want values between 1 to 3 with a step size of 1, but I want values between 5 to 9 with a step size of 0.25. And the nice thing about this is that now all of these values in the range are distributed based on random distribution, but you can also set it to noise, so the same values still apply, but now you applying it based on a noise pattern. What we also did is we simplified parameters like element size, where now you have only one single parameter control, and if you want to access the per component control, you have a nice button at the end of the parameter to do that. And we have simplified the warping controls a bit, so it's much easier to create interesting looking patterns as well. And then going on, we have another new thing introduced now in the attribute adjust float node, which is unit conversion. So the original idea is coming from the fact that let's say attributes like life attributes are in seconds in Houdini. So a value of 1 means your particle is gonna live for 1 second. But what if you want to make your particles live exactly for 5 frames? what is the value for that? It's something like 0.2 whatever, like you would not necessarily know this. So before, you would have to create expressions such as this one to kind of get the right values in seconds. But now attribute adjust float node is able to do this unit conversion for you. So if I wanna do this example I just told you, I would set the value here to 5. That way, and I can set the unit settings to duration, and I can say that my attributes is gonna be in the unit of seconds, but my constant value is gonna be in the unit of frames. So now the node will know that the value of 5 will actually have to be converted into seconds. And the other thing we tried to do, and you might already realize that we tried to really unify the interfaces for all of these nodes. So if you have a quick look at it, you will see that the noise pattern, the general tab interface, like all of this, we tried to match as much as possible for each of these nodes. So that if you, let's say, starting to use one of the nodes, it's much easier to get used to all other nodes. Okay, so Pyro sourcing and the burst workflow. So we have a new node, Pyro burst source node, and this node generates animated points in random shapes, and you can use this as, like, you can convert them to source volumes for Pyro. So if we have a look at an example, this is the node where you can set initial size, direction, you can make it as grand explosion or make it more atmospheric explosion, and then you got the seed control. And as I said, these are animated bursts, so that you will see that they are animated over time to an expanded size. And the third tab is the burst components, where you see where all of these color points are created. So there is one set of points created for burn and one set of points created for temperature, and these points correspond to the volumes needed for pyro, temperature, burn, etc. Then I wanna have a quick look at the quick setup menu. So this is something we have introduced for the Pyro tools in 18.5. So these menus are like not really presets, but they generate smaller node networks either before or after the node. And these set of nodes will help you, it can help you setting up this node, or can help you go on the next task you would need to do. So for example, here I'm using the single input point, which will put down an add node before the node, so therefore I can just place the burst where I want in location in space. Then this one is the source volume quick setup element. So this way all of the burst components you create will be connected and automatically updated with the volume rasterize attribute. So you never have to type manually the attributes you want to rasterize. Let's go on to the next step, single burst. So let's see how to control source values and how to do some overrides for the burst. So in this one, you will see that I have a burn parameter, and I can, if I just go back quickly, I can enable scaling along the trailing of the burst. So all of the burn values now, at the tip, they are much lower than at the center of the burst. Then you have a basic noising functionality, so you can add noise to the burst. And what the cool thing is here is that now I have enabled both burn and temperature, and I can enable the seed burst override. So now I will have different seeds for each of these burst components, making the sourcing even more complex and varying, which would give more interesting results. And here I'm just playing with the start frame override actually. So I can even override the start frame for all the temperature or burn components, giving you even more control over the sourcing. And I'm just here adding density here and just doing the same, enabling a seed override, and this is the kind of burst I'm getting after all of these modifications. Then let's level up again for even more complex explosion sourcing. So all of these examples you have seen only used a single input point, but you can create multiple input points, and there is a way to randomize to give even more randomization for all of these bursts. So looking at this example, I have an add node here, and then which creates a single point, but I'm replicating it and I'm making 3 points out of it and plugging that into the Pyro burst source node. Now I have 3 bursts like coming out exactly at the same time. Now we have a menu here introduced next to many of these parameters, which controls how these start frame values are assigned. So what you will see here is the default is set uniform, which will use whatever parameter value you set on the interface. But we provide a simple interface to vary the values very quickly on the interface. For that, I'm just setting it to set varying, and you will notice the additional parameters. And now basically I'm just modifying the start frame attribute per incoming point a bit to give it more variations. So, and I can also do the same with burst size as well. So you see that the power of this is, it's really great that you can just very easily create multiple bursts even for one single explosion, and even you can use multiple points for one single explosion, because that gives a much more interesting looking explosion. And then there is another way you can randomize the values per incoming point, and this is of course if you create the attribute values before the node, and each of these parameters are corresponding to so each of the parameters on the Pyro burst source node corresponds to an attribute, and if that attribute exists, you have to set this menu to pick up those attributes or that attribute. So here I just clicked on the randomize icon here, which will put down an attribute adjust node. So here I'm just gonna set the start frame attribute, and you will see now I'm using that attribute. So you will see that each of these birds just popping out one after the other. And then what I can also do is to randomize the source value per incoming point. So here I just created a burn attribute, an attribute adjust node for burn, so that I can randomize the burn value for each of these bursts. So now on default I'm just increasing the value from 1 to something higher, but I can also randomize the values per burst. And the really nice thing is that if these values, like burn value is 0 on some of these points, then there will be no corresponding burst component created for that node, for that burst, sorry. So that this way you will really get true randomization for this burst. Let's look at the trail workflow then. One of the node you can use is the Pyro trail path node. So this generates the path for the projectiles that fly out from the explosion or from the burst, and these paths are generated without an actual simulation. So there is no pop simulation involved in this, which means that these are very fast to generate and very fast to iterate over certain look and certain, you know, properties of this path. But as a drawback, that means they cannot handle complex collisions, even though we introduce some sort of basic collision detection that could help you with most cases. So if we look at the node, this is the Pyro Trail path node, and you can see all the paths generated from a single burst. So you can change the direction of this path. You can change the number of trails, for example, of course. Here I'm just making more path and just prune it by a noise, so it gives variation on all sides. Then if you want some more specific control over how they directed, you can use the spread angle to have the trails coming out from all across the unit sphere, or you can make them fly out only on one side of the explosion, such as this one. So you have really great control over how these trails are controlled. You have options to change or randomize the initial launch speed of these projectiles, which will make them fly up more stronger. Then of course you have drag, mass options there, and you can change how long these projectiles live, and just some basic collision detection options, so you can clip below a certain height. And with the next one, with this next one, I just want to show you what Emily did for her project here, is that she used this basic collision detection, which you find on this node, to kind of make the trails bounce with a box, and you get these nice trails, like, you know, bouncing off. And for most cases, I think this provides a very good control. Then, yeah, so these are only the paths, but the question is, you can ask, so how do we get the actual points? Like, how do we get animated points out of these curves and use them as the pyro source? So the answer to that is the pyro trail source node, which is, I consider it as the sister node of the pyro burst source node. So the input is the trail path, which generated by the Pyro trail path node, and this node, as you see here, will take those paths and just generates all the trail points onto each of these projectile paths, and these are all animated now, and you can use them for pyro sourcing. There are, as you see, controls over the source value, over the length. You can use some of these options to, for example, just convert them to volume and use them straight out to render them without actually putting it into any pyro simulation, which could be useful for explosions very far in the background, where you do not really need these trails to be actually part of the simulation. Then what you can do still is apply some noise on these trails, so you can make them, you know, a bit more irregular as they fly to the path. And here I'm just showing one of these other tricks which most of these examples we did use, is I'm just making a temperature source additionally, and I'm changing the length scale of it to very small, so that they only present at the tip of these trails. In the pyro simulation, I'm just only sourcing the density, for example, but not this temperature. And these temperature values are only combined before the shading and used only to make the tip of the explosion glow a bit. So far what I have shown is just a very basic way and the most quickest way to create trails. But there's a lot more going on in the background. So let's look into that. So the Pyro Scatter from burst node is a very special point replicate node for Pyro, and its whole purpose is to just scatter points around the input points, and assigns velocity attribute and start frame attribute, and you can use this to generate your projectiles. So, and these projectiles can be generated with the ballistic path node. So it expects points with velocity attributes, and it generates these curves with an additional time point attribute. And this is very, very important. The extract point from curve node then can take these curves, and using this time attribute, it can sort of extract the position of the projectiles from the curve at a given time. So let's look at it in practice. So here you see that I have a Pyro Shader from burst node creating points. Then the ballistic path node is templated so that I'm showing all the pyro trails created here. But then I'm taking the extract point from curve node and I'm just playing the timeline, and you can see that I'm using the time attribute and cut it by the current time, and that gives me all of these animated points across the trails, therefore giving me the position of the projectile at the current time. But the Pyro Shader from burst node, the generated points from it can be used for many other things. So for example, they could be starting point for Spark simulations or custom trail setups, or again, custom trail setups where you want to use particle simulation to generate your trails. So here, for example, again, I'm just showing you the trails you would get from a ballistic path node. But on the Pyro Shader from burst node, you can use the quick setup menu, and by selecting the particle simulation option, you will be getting a whole set of network that will use the points from the Pyro Shader from burst node, and these will be used them for can be used for custom particle simulation. So this is all set up for you. Then here you can also choose simulated trails. So this is very much the same network, but additionally we will have a ballistic path from simulation network here, which actually, as you see, generates trail paths very much matching the trails given by the ballistic path node, so that if you need something very specific collisions or something very specific things that you can only do with particle simulation, you still have the option to do very matching ballistic paths using the simulation way. And here I'm just putting down a Pyro trail source node to demonstrate that it's all also working using the Pyro trail source node. There is one more thing I want to mention, and this is targeted launch for ballistic path node. So here I'm just putting down a circle, scatter some points on this circle, and storing this point location in a target P attribute, then moving everything back to the origin. With the ballistic path node, I can select launch method targeted, and with the targeting method, I can set a certain constraint. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying that every projectile should end at the target position, or should aim to hit the target position, but I can give certain constraint, like let's say while it's hitting the target position, the projectile should be at a certain, or should also reach a certain height, or should live for certain seconds. So this gives you a lot more interesting control over the projectiles. And for example, here I'm just randomizing the target position as well. So you can get really customized pyro trail path for your explosions. So let's do something a bit more exciting then, and let's start to combine trails and bursts. So you can do it a couple of ways, and one of the ways is the single burst way. So one single burst for each explosion. And here I'm creating just a line with 5 points, and I'm assigning start frame attribute randomly to these points, and with the Pyro burst source node, I just pick up this attribute and created randomization how they popping up. Then I do the same with the Pyro trail path node as well. And now if I display the Pyro trail source and the Pyro burst source, you will see that the bursts and the trails are all organized, well, they are all synchronized actually together based on a common start frame attribute. And here I'm just also showing that I customized the launch speed of these trail paths per incoming explosion, so that I can make the trails coming out from one explosion much larger than the others, for example. So this can give you a lot more control over the consecutive explosion look. And then here I'm just again displaying them all, the trails. Then let's again do like step up a bit, and let's do the next level, which is like the multiple bursts per explosion. So here I have a very similar setup, and I again creating start frame attribute here per each point, and then I'm just replicating points on each of these points, 3 actually to be exact, and creating explosion ID and burst ID. And the main idea is here that I want to make every explosion, every of my 5 explosion explode at a different time, but I also want to make sure that every burst inside that explosion I also randomized a bit relative to the main start frame, or the main ignition frame really. So here I'm just showing you that the explosion ID is the same for each of these clusters, and then I'm using just an attribute adjust float to randomize the start frame attribute based on the burst ID, so they now got a bit of offset, which you can see, like this is the one before the shifting, and then this is after the second randomization. And now what you will see is that again each of these bursts are a bit offset to one another. And for the trails, again, what is important in this kind of setups is fusing the input points, because now I'm using 3 input points for the same explosion, which will generate a lot more trails than what you would need. And you can fuse the input points by an attribute, and here I'm using the explosion ID, so that only one input point will generate trails for the given explosion. So this covers the most important aspect of pyro sourcing, and hopefully this brief introduction will help you to get started and give you some ideas what you can achieve with the tools. And then for the second part of this presentation, then let's talk about shading, and then we will looking at examples. What has changed shading wise, and one of the most important thing is to move away from the physical Blackbody, and I put an angry fruit salad here because I know that some of you might not gonna like this, but it doesn't mean that physical Blackbody has been removed. It just, on most of the tools, this is not the default anymore, in favor of this nice pretty looking color ramp. So we have decided about this because my personal experience working with physical Blackbody. So I find it very hard to control, and it's very easy to get this kind of what I would call a burned shrimp look. So you get this super bright yellows, super bright reds in it, and it just to me, my personal opinion is that it just does not gives realistic results, even though it should represent physically accurate coloring. And none of the explosion I seen in production and I said, wow, this explosion looks really sexy and amazing, none of those explosions were done using physical Blackbody methods. And as I said, instead we went for this ramp which goes from black to the actual explosion color, which is this nice orange color in default, and this allows us to create nice looking explosion out of the box. And if you need to change the explosion color to, let's say, blue, you only have to change the color at the right side of the ramp to blue. And here, just to show all the different looks, so this is the top is the explosion viewed with physical Blackbody coloring. Then the middle one is using the ramp and viewed from the Pyro SOP solver. And this last one is also using the same ramp, but it's viewed through the Pyro Bake volume node, and it's also has this nice crunchy look enabled to it. So, and we will talk about it in a second. And just to show you, this is the side explosion. I will go through. This is the kind of coloring and look that you could get on default with this ramp. The other thing we tried to change for 18.5 is the use of the flame field for the shading. So now that physical Blackbody, we're trying to move away from that. We no longer really need the flame field either to use this for shading. So yeah, you can consider it as one less field to export and worry about. So except one, all of our examples we have done for 18.5 are using only density and temperature for shading, even the bonfire. So I consider the flame field as just an additional field that helps you shape your simulation. It doesn't mean that that on the Pyro Solver tab you got the flame tab, and this allows for, as I said, additional controls like to add expansion through the flame field, or to add additional temperature and additional density through the flame field, which is all great, but this is not the secret. For example, to create good looking fire, as I said, you only need density, temperature, and some, nice turbulence controls. That's not said that, it's not useful. It's very, very useful. You just, it's important for you to know where and how to use it. So, for example, as I said, there was one exception, and this was Ian's project. So Ian was working on this firecracker project, and he was using both flame and temperature fields to shade this smoke plume. And the reason for this is because we were looking at references, and we were seeing this like big plume of smokes, and inside there you would see this kind of cluster of bursts like popping out, sometimes here, sometimes there, like very randomly at different places. And Ian was sourcing in density, of course, from the firecrackers, but also temperature everywhere where you got density. So that meant that we couldn't really just use temperature, because temperature is pretty much everywhere where density is. So Ian created this kind of localized flame sources randomly at certain locations, and these were sourced into as flames, and these field then were used to shade this kind of explosion burst in the smoke. And then also we were using the temperature field, that which was actually masked, to kind of create this additional kind of rising flame components as well. The other important thing to mention is the ASYS workflow. So all of the examples we have done, which you see on the right side, for example, were done using the ASYS workflow. And if you install Houdini and you just open it up and you start to work with Pyro, what you will end up is basically the look on the left side. And to get from this to the right side, look, you have to install, or you have to set up ASYS with Houdini. And yeah, please go to the documentation under the Pyro shading section. You will find information how to get going with ASYS. And the other important thing is a good quality HDRI map. So, you can shade or light your explosions using area lights, but one of the easiest way is to just drop down an environment light and use a good quality HDRI map. And I'm saying good quality here because there is a big difference between HDRI maps, and the good quality one can give you really nice coloring into the on the smoke components of your explosions, and especially when used with absorption color, which I will talk about on the shader. I would like to talk about some of the changes I made on the Pyro solver for the content library explosions. So basically, this is about parameters that usually good to animate. For example, time scale and buoyancy scale is something that I kind of tend to animate when I'm working on like a single explosion. So I'm pretty sure we are all familiar with the typical, okay, let's set up a couple of keyframes, but then as I scrub the timeline, the simulation trying to update, then I have to set the updating to manual mode, but then I also have to open up the animation curve editor. So it could be rather cumbersome to set up even a couple of keyframes. And the way I go about this is creating a couple of spare parameters. And here you can see that the time scale is driven based on an expression which is driven by a couple of parameters. So here what I'm saying is that at the start frame, my buoyancy scale should have the value of 1.75, but in the duration of 10 frames, this 1.75 should shrink down to a value of 1. So now instead of keyframes, I'm just using these parameters to control the animation aspect of the timescale parameter. And this has been introduced to timescale, buoyancy scale, and the turbulence strength on the shape tab. The other thing is the way I set up the look tab on the Pyro solver. So as I do not use physical Blackbody, to me the default setup where the flame field is used for the fire intensity and the temperature is used for the fire color, this visualization kind of tells me nothing really. It's not useful for me. But what is useful for me is to just display the temperature or the flame over the density. So what I do is I use the same field. It could be temperature flame or flame field for both intensity and color. And I use the same flame range to clamp both intensity and the color. So that way, I can visualize temperature over the smoke, and then I can get a sense of my temperature field or my flame field separately, which I find much more useful also later to set up the scattering and the crunchy details. Now that I mentioned the flame intensity and color ranges, it is really important to know the maximum volume values to set up these ranges correctly. So I don't mean that you have to know these on every frame, but please make sure that you know the maximum values for density, temperature, flame, etc. on couple of the important frames that you would use for shading your explosion, because that could really help you to kind of nail down the look of the explosion. And you can find this information on the actual geometry as primitive attribute, and this is automatically created for you using the Pyro subsolver. After all of this, I think we are finally ready to look at the scene file for the fireball, which is in the content library. So here I use pretty much the default setting for the Pyro burst source. I changed the duration a bit longer, and I made the temperature and the burn sources a bit larger than the actual temperature source. And then with the Pyro solver, I'm just putting it somewhere where the simulation is a bit more advanced in time. And And what's important is to mention here is the density sourcing. So I'm using rather high value, a scale of 5 with the add operation. So this will create loads of high value density. And then what is important to mention here, yes, so because I'm using such high density values, I kind of wanted to make this example not to use the smoke emission based on the flame, but I input a bit of temperature based on the flame, and I'm driving a bit of expansion using the flame. The other important thing to mention is the disturbance. So I'm using a rather high disturbance with a speed field as the control field. So this is important to get the crunchy kind of details into the simulation, that the density fields is kind of nicely disturbed. And the speed field is just tells you how fast the fluid is moving actually. And this is calculated based on the checkbox on the simulation tab. So if you enable calculate speed field, then you can use the keyword speed into your control fields to control, for example, disturbance or turbulence. And then the other thing is the turbulence, which I mentioned. I'm using my custom animation controls to animate turbulence so that at the beginning it's a very high value of 5, and then in the duration of 10 frames it just shrinks down to 0.05. And I'm using a rather large swirl size for this turbulence. So the purpose of this turbulence is to just create some at the burst of the explosion where the explosion expands the most. I just want to tear up the kind of expansion a lot to create more interesting large kind of noises to break up the simulation. So that's why I'm kind of the only using very strong turbulence just in the first couple of frames. And of course I'm using the density as kind of control field for that. And the other thing which is important to mention is all of these settings on the export tab. So if you enable these and you resample your velocity, and if you use 16-bit float, this will really help you to save this space on your caches up to, I don't know, you can reduce them up to only even 10-15% of your of what would be your cache on default. So what settings were used for the side explosion? Here you can see that I'm creating sort of a multi-burst explosion. So as I said, even though it's a single explosion, I'm using multiple input points for generating multiple burst sources, which gives kind of the look of one single explosion. And again, here I change a couple of settings, for example, the direction parameter. And as you can see, I'm adding a bit of noise into the sourcing as well. And in this simulation, I do emit smoke into the simulation based on the flame, but here I decided not to use temperature. And the settings are pretty much the same as well. So the disturbance is also controlled by speed again, and also a rather large disturbance value I use. And also the turbulence is also very strong at the beginning, but reduced a lot over a period of 10 frames. So after the simulation, let's talk about finally the shading. So we have a new node, which is the Pyro Bake Volume node. So this node, I think the best way to understand this node, if you consider this as a Pyro look node, so it's kind of same in functionality with the Pyro post process node's look tab. So this node has all the options and parameters to control the look of your simulations. So you got the smoke tab to shade simple smoke elements. But if you want to work with fire and explosion, you got three separate emission components. So you got scatter, fire, and secondary fire, which each controls the emission component in its own way. With the pyrobake volume node, I tried to simplify the labeling, how volumes are assigned to the different emission aspects. So if you look at here the pyro post-process node and how it was set up previously, you will see that there are two sections. One is actually just simply labeled fire, but this actually controls the fire intensity. But then the other section is labeled as fire color, which is rightfully controls the color of the fire. But when I go back and see, so what are the volumes that are binding to this, I realize that the fire color, it's actually binded to a parameter which is called temperature, and the fire intensity section is binded to a parameter which is labeled flame. So it's rather kind of confusing which is responsible for what. And this is just gets exponentially confusing for me when I have to work with the Pyro Shader, where again this kind of situation shows up again. And to kind of simplify this on the pyrobake volume node, I tried to create labels according intensity and color. So we got an intensity volume label, which is actually responsible for the intensity aspect of the fire. And then we got the color volume, which is actually responsible for the color section here. So hopefully this way it's much easier to find which volume controls which sections. And well, in this case now both of these volumes are controlled through temperature. On top of this, I tried to make sure that the interface for the pyrobake volume and the new Pyro Shader are resembling each other. So you will see that the same tabbing in the same order, and also many of the parameters labeled the same. The only difference what you see here now on the smoke tab is coming from the fact that some of the features on the shader are like considered more sort of advanced controls that are currently not possible visualizing in the viewport. Therefore, these controls on the pyrobake volume are not available. To get all the nice crunchy looking details in the explosion, you also have to use the pyrobake volume node. So when the scattering is enabled on this node, a special volume is generated which is called the scatter volume. And to generate this scatter volume, you actually have to use an existing input volume, which is on default the temperature. So this temperature volume then gets basically converted to the scatter volume. So if we look at an example, this is just, I'm just here enabling scattering. So here what you see now is basically just the temperature visualized, and I have a rather high intensity scale here. But then what's happening here is that I'm taking this temperature, and which is a float volume, and internally this node converting this float volume based on the source range to vector volume representing RGB colors based on the scatter color ramp. So and the end result is what you see in the viewport now. After this, if I enable the blurring, what you will see is that this generated color volume now it's blurred out and creating this really nice looking kind of internal scattering for the explosion. So after this, you can set the source range, and for example here I'm just saying that more of the temperature should contribute into the scattering, therefore making it brighter or creating more scattering inside. Then the last thing is the masking, and this is a very important part for the crunchy look. So what's happening is that we're using a masking volume which is on default the density. And basically what I'm saying here is whenever the density is lower than the combination of the mask center and the mask squid, we're gonna let the scattering shine through, the scattered volume to shine through. And wherever the density values are higher than this combination of mask center and mask width, there we will actually cut out the scattering and we will let the smoke through. And again, here I'm just changing the amount of scattering I want to apply to this explosion, so therefore creating completely different look, and how the kind of fire kind of fades off in the explosion. The Pyro Bake volume automatically comes with a Pyro Shader inside of it, and this Pyro Shader is referencing all the parameters on the Pyro Bake volume node, so therefore trying to make sure that the look what you got in the viewport is matching the render look as close as possible. So for example, here I have the Pyro Bake volume, and I just dive inside to access the shader, and you will see that you got all the parameters referencing the node, but you also, important to mention, that you got additional parameters on the shader that is not available on the Pyro Bake volume node. And this is because for example, what this use control volume does is it allows you to scale the smoke density with another volume such as temperature, and kind of do this post operation in the shader. But unfortunately, operation like this is not supported by the volume visualization node, so therefore we cannot visualize this in the viewport. So there are a couple of controls like this for which you actually have to dive inside the shader, but it provides a better control on rendering. And also one other thing which is important to mention, the absorption color. Again, this is not available on the Pyro Bake volume node, but with this, if you're starting to change the color of the absorption color, then you will see that the smoke kind of changes color as the light scatters through the volume. So with this you can create a lot more realistic looking smoke effects. Then again, couple of other parameters. You also see that you got the scatter, the fire interfaces, and all of these are automatically linked up to the Pyro Bake volume node. Then the material, as I was pointing, it's the Pyro Bake volume has the assign material path, which actually points to the internal Pyro shader. But to manage the shaders, you can go to the quick setup menu, and here what you can do is break material reference, and that will dereference all the parameters from the shader. And this is important because if you change the parameters on the Pyro Bake volume while you trying to do interactive render updates, it might take a bit of time to recook the volume every time for rendering. And by breaking the references to the material node, the geometry do not have to update, so your interactive render updates will be much faster. Of course, this means that your Pyro Bake volume settings might no longer match up with the settings used on your Pyro shader. But then you can also create new materials using the quick setup menu, and you can choose where to create it. You can, for example, I just do it next to the Pyro Bake volume, and you see you create the same kind of linked shader setup. And of course I can break the material reference to this node, and then I just create one node inside the Pyro bake volume. So, and then you see now a second material node is created there, and now that material is assigned to the node, and this is really nice. I find it really nice to kind of collect couple of Pyro shaders inside the Pyro bake volume node, and this really allowed me to kind of just copy one single Pyro bake volume over a couple of different setups and easily get different Pyro looks. So basically Pyro bake volume kind of acts as a container for my different look depth setups. So as I said, the density can be or the smoke can be scaled on the Pyro shader using a control volume, and on default again this is temperature, and this will allow us to do some super nice trick which were not possible before. And what you see here is the side explosion rendered on the left side without this the use of this control volume scale. But on the right side I enable this, and what this will allow after playing around with the values is that you can get this really nice tentrily looking smoke details detaching from the fire. And this is something again which you will see a lot on real explosion references, but before they were not possible to get to this kind of realistic looking details with previous shaders. And just again to show you here the couple of versions for the side explosion. Again here this is without the control volume, and then here I'm just on this one on top of the scattering I enable the fire component on the shader and on the Pyro bake volume. So I'm getting and I had to balance it out a bit, but I'm getting this really nice kind of fainty kind of flame leftover in the smoke kind of effect. And then for the last one, this is with the enabled control volume, where I'm actually scaling the smoke density with the temperature, and you will see this really nice kind of tendrils detaching from the fire. As the last thing, I just want to show you the other option we introduced on the quick setup menu to help you set up rendering of your simulations as fast as possible. So here I'm just using the simple fireball as an example. I'm putting down the shelf tool example, and then on the Pyro bake volume node, I'm just going and simulating a couple of frames first. Yeah, that should be enough. And then using the create lights and cameras option, I can say use this geometry as my rendered geometry, and I'm getting all the lights and camera set up. So what you should do is you set your viewport in the position where you want to render from, so that way the camera will be created exactly from that angle. And then also volume light and environment light will be set up for you automatically. And the top network with a mantra node that already has some image planes set it up for you, but these are disabled on default. And then you got some options to start and get going the rendering with a very low resolution render. To close the presentation, I would like to show you this really nice explosion done by Jeffy Matthew. So here you can see all of these components working together, the new shader, the trails, the bursts, and even he went a step further and he used the Pyro burst source node to create the kind of shockwaves. And basically the secret here is that you just instance the Pyro burst sources onto a circle, each pointing outwards, and when they are animated and expanding, and clip by the ground, they can, you know, create the essence of kind of a ground shockwave expanding out from the explosion. So then that's it for this presentation, and there was a lot to cover in this session, and I hope that it's a good overview of what you can do, and it helps you get you going with all the tools introduced in 18.5 for Pyro, and I'm looking forward to see many great looking explosions, and yeah, thank you for watching.